box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions throughout the program, and then we'll collect those and do our best to get answers for you at the end of the program. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Sean Egan, MIOSHA's COVID-19 Workplace Safety Director. Sean is a lifelong West Michigander and activist for working people and families. He served in the U.S. Navy and then served an apprenticeship and became a journeyman electrician through the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW. He maintains his membership in his union and state license as a journeyman to this day. He first served with the IBEW Local 275 union as a shop steward, and then ultimately was elected by the union members to serve as head of the local union, representing construction electricians, manufacturing, broadcasting, and electrical motor service industries. As union leader, Sean managed the nonprofit operations and representational activities for its members. In 2010, Sean was named one of the 40 under 40 by the Grand Rapids Business Journal. During the years he led his union, he also served on the board of the Heart of West Michigan United Way, including the executive committee and with the Financial Independence Initiative. At the same time, he continued his education in earning a bachelor's degree in business administration from Davenport University, and then a Juris Doctorate from Thomas M. Cooley Law School. He has served as president of the local AFL-CIO Labor Council, the local Building Trades Council, and the Labor Heritage Society of West Michigan. He served on many boards throughout the labor movement across the state of Michigan and continues to serve in leadership roles with groups aimed at helping people lift themselves into the middle class. Prior to being hired in at Michigan's Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, he was employed as an attorney for IBEW and other labor unions and worker-focused groups across Michigan. And then upon arriving at LEO, his focus was primarily overseeing MIOSHA, Workers' Disability and Compensation Agency, the Bureau of Employment Relations, and the Wage and Hour Division. Earlier this year, when everything changed, on June 5th, Governor Gretchen Whitmer appointed Sean to serve as the director of COVID-19 Workplace Safety. Welcome, Sean. We are delighted to have you here today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Diane and Tony, for having me today. And that I got to shorten that bio. It's pretty long, isn't it? It's like half of our time now. I think what that tells everybody that's participating today is that, I bring real world experience, not only in how we analyze policy, working with businesses and trying to do other things, but as well as having actually been in those types of establishments and worked in the field. So I can bring a perspective that's really helpful, I hope, to all of you to understand some of the things that we're trying to do and why. If you joined me yesterday afternoon for our live Q&A session, some of the information you're going to see today will be the same. I'm going to flow through it pretty quickly just for the sake of time and making sure we have a good time for questions and answers. But I can tell you that our goal, the governor's goal, has been to get open and stay open. And as we've seen, community spread, as we thought in the fall might get worse, has gotten incredibly worse across the state of Michigan. I was doing a little bit of comparison this morning, just kind of trying to take in to perspective what we've seen with COVID in our state. And as you all know, we're currently at about 263,000 confirmed cases of COVID in our state, and that's growing rapidly. Just for perspective, that's Ann Arbor, Battle Creek, Bay City combined, plus 50,000 more cases. So it's just a testament to how much we're all struggling to manage this, and I know that you're doing it too. While we're dealing with COVID, as you all know, and have been working toward, a few things have stayed the same, and I really want to focus on these because it's important for understanding the rules as well as the DHHS orders. We know that the three primary things that we're trying to accomplish are social distance, wearing face coverings when we can't do that, and maintaining good hygiene so that we don't pick it up from surfaces. And we still believe, and that this virus largely spreads through large respiratory droplets and aerosols that we emit from ourselves when we talk, sing, sneeze, cough, you name it. And that about 40% of those folks that have this virus are spreading this virus will be asymptomatic, meaning they're always going to feel fine, not going to have any symptoms, but they're able to transmit, which just reinforces these concepts of distance, mask, hygiene. Another significant percentage is going to be spreading this before they even have symptoms. Again, those same concepts. So when we're talking about the rules today, when you're looking at the DHHS orders, these are the concepts we're trying to get to, is helping to maintain that social distance. That includes originally that stay home, stay safe order, the ultimate social distance, but these capacity limits and other things we've been talking about, and the remote work that we're going to talk about today to just try to maintain, create even more social distance between people because this virus is spreading so quickly. All through the summer, even as we've reopened, all of you are trying to implement these great practices to keep your workplaces safe. We're seeing a lot of workplace outbreaks. Now, I want you to keep in mind, an outbreak does not mean an error. All of these tools that we're talking about are mitigation strategies to help keep from spreading COVID in our communities and our workplaces, but it could still happen. And with our community numbers as high as they are, more than likely it will happen. So you need to be prepared to respond to that and try to create these environments where on the remote piece, we get people out, where we have people in there, you're requiring those face coverings, you're trying to set up operations the best that you can to create that social distance and thinking about mitigation strategies. Now, just on Monday, DHHS updates their coronavirus dashboards, which includes outbreak numbers in workplaces. And I pull off schools, colleges, childcare, nursing homes, and a couple of others where there's probably high numbers of non-employees being exposed to the virus or getting the virus. There are workers in those environments as well, so these numbers would be higher, but I try to focus on where we can look and see that these are more than likely employee outbreaks directly. And about 210 of those ongoing outbreaks are associated with construction or manufacturing, and 31 are associated with offices. And offices have been high all through the summer, higher than most other industries through the summer. They weren't huge numbers, but they're growing. And then just that last week, we had 93 new workplace outbreaks. And what I'm looking at, only 9 were in office settings. And that sounds good. The week prior, it was 18, one of the highest. So we really have to watch what's happening in these types of environments and recognize that as our community numbers go up, we're going to have these challenges. And just for reference, about 17 outbreaks and social gatherings in that week. So when we compare that to workplace numbers, we can see that anywhere we congregate, work, social gathering, or otherwise, creates challenges for containing COVID. So we have to be very, very diligent. And Michigan's positivity rate is very high at 12.8%. If we look at the Midland region, it's actually higher than that. Midland itself is right in line with those numbers. The cases per million is actually a little bit higher. So it's happening. It's happening all over the state, and it's happening very, very fast and quickly. So when the executive orders started transitioning to now the emergency rules you're working with, as well as the DHHS orders, one of the things that we were shooting for with MIOSHA was consistency between what you were doing before with what's expected now. So if you're working through that, there's a lot of consistency in those rules. We took out sort of the variables, which we would, as COVID morphs and changes and things need to happen, the MIOSHA rules are intended to be more static for the next several months. So I would encourage you to really get familiar. We have a template preparedness and response plan right on our website, COVID Workplace Safety, created by MIOSHA that you can use for your workplace. If you already have one, you don't need to change it. But make sure that you have these rules sort of figured out and mapped out, and we have tools to help you do that. And then layer in the DHHS orders based on what your industry is and things that you need to be doing according to those orders. That will really help you navigate what you need to do. One part remaining relatively static and one part a little bit more variable. One of the things that's in the rules are a lot about face coverings. And in low and medium risk work environments, it's very similar to what you're used to in that where employees cannot maintain 6 feet of separation, they need to wear face coverings. If they're in shared spaces like hallways, in-person meetings, break rooms, restrooms, etc., they need to be wearing those face coverings. We do have some industry-specific requirements listed in there as well. very similar to what was expected of those types of industries previously. So make sure you're aware of those and check those out if you fall into those categories. On Friday, we launched a MIOSHA state emphasis program focusing on office environments. And the reason we're doing that is that offices traditionally don't deal with MIOSHA very often. You have standards that you must follow, you know that, but they're very limited for the office environment because there's not a lot of hazards normally present in the office environment. COVID changes that, just like it did everything else in 2020, it kind of changes that as well. So this emphasis program is intended to get us out there with all of you that have office environments and really focus in on what these rules are. MIOSHA's goal is always to educate before they regulate. So the goal here is not gotcha, it's to make sure that you're in compliance, make sure you have the pieces in place, and show that good faith effort. You hear me say that a lot. MIOSHA is always looking for a good faith effort to comply with the rules. And as long as you're doing that, you'll be fine. But some of the things that you must have are those preparedness and response plans. You must be doing daily health screenings, which includes a questionnaire on potential symptoms. There's a tool I'll mention in a second. You need to be training your employees. We're hearing that a lot, that employees aren't actually being trained on how COVID spreads, how you can prevent it, what your policies and procedures are, how they report if they have symptoms or don't feel well, how you get them out of the workplace. There are record-keeping requirements in there, which includes training, which includes those daily health screenings. You do not need to keep the answers of the screenings, but you do need to keep the pass-fail. And that's because MIOSHA is going to ask for those things if there's a complaint filed, or worst case scenario, you have a fatality that may be linked to a workplace exposure. They have an obligation to investigate that. So they're going to ask you some questions about that or look into it. And you want to be able to just provide those records. And then primarily remote work in the state emphasis program, we have a rule that says that employers shall create a policy prohibiting in-person work for those that can feasibly be completed remotely. A lot of questions, of course, on what that means. You have to be trying to get people out of the workplace the best that you can. Feasible means a few things, but it does take into account economics, technical, practical issues. Certainly, we understand that some workers may need to be physically present. Certainly, those doing production or construction are going to need to be physically present for the vast majority of folks. In the office environment, that's going to be true for some as well. You need to keep your business operating. You get mail, you get things. There are things in person that need to be done. Perhaps there are some client interactions depending on what you do, but you need to create that policy, and it can be in your preparedness and response plan. And it needs to include a couple of things. So when MIOSHA's popping in on these the state emphasis program, which are just randomly selected office environments that they're going to stop in, won't be underhanded. They're going to announce themselves. They're going to talk to management. They're going to do what they normally do, but they're going to ask you for your remote work policy. And you're going to want to include in that determination which positions or classifications need to be in person and why that can't be performed remotely. They're not going to dig really deep on the why it can't, as long as you've created a reasoned and thoughtful policy around that. And these people have to be in this location because of X. What we're trying to avoid here is that I just feel my team needs to be in person, or I like it better when people are in here. Because as I mentioned with these case numbers, we have to try to create that maximum separation, and getting as many people out of these environments as possible helps to mitigate the spread with those that must be in that environment. We have wonderful tools, guidelines. If you look at the rules and are confused, we have guidelines for every industry that are in compliance with the emergency rules. You can find those at michigan.gov, COVID workplace safety, and we have a lot of other information there. We have a MIOSHA hotline for employers and employees. They set up in May, I believe they launched it. It's a wonderful tool. The wait time's been about 15 seconds to get into a MIOSHA expert. Call them as often as you need to talk through what you're trying to do in your workplaces. It's 855-SAFE-C19. Great tool. Average call length's about 4 to 5 minutes to get through whatever issues you're having. But that's a great resource for you, and I would encourage you to make sure you take advantage of it. MIOSHA has long done consultation. They continue to do that. If you go to the MIOSHA website, there is a consultation tab there where you can request consultation for things that you're trying to do. They can do that in person, they can do it over the phone, they can review some materials if you want to work with them that way. It's pretty much free of charge. There are a couple limited services that do have a fee, but none of this stuff. But they will work with you. And we have a proactive consultation program we've launched called the Ambassador Program, where we're focusing on those what we call heightened community transmission risk establishments. So those are generally open to the public, small retail, gyms, bars and restaurants, those types of places, to really help them understand what they need to be implementing to ensure that we're not only protecting our employees, but we're creating the safest environment we can as it relates to COVID for our customers as well, because that does increase potential employee exposure. So you're going to see some press on that, as well as a link to request a consultation if you're in one of those types of industries. If you are not, you can use the traditional consultation program to help you with some of these tools and resources. We have great links there. I encourage you for the daily health screenings to use the My Symptoms app, unless you're using something else, that's fine. Created by DHHS and U of M, that has the daily questionnaire. Your employees get linked to you. Employer set up a code, the employee gets that code, and it'll be linked back to you. You'll see real-time reports on who's taken it, who's passed and failed. That will also do that record-keeping component for you. And the employee will get a flag on their smartphone, tablet, whatever they're using to do the questionnaire, on whether or not they've flagged for symptoms. Definitely new, recently launched, you saw in the news, is the Michigan.gov My COVID Alert, which uses cell phone technology to identify when you've come in range with somebody that's been identified as a confirmed case of COVID. Great resource out there. Free as well. Definitely encourage people to check that out and use it. So for the sake of our time, and I know I was really, really fast, but I really like to focus on questions. I'm going to stop there and we can get rolling.
There we go. Okay, thank you. That was a great overview, real quick and dirty. So what questions do we have out there, folks? I don't see anything in the Q&A box just yet.
I have a couple, Diane, that I can share that I'm getting quite often, and that is, as we're seeing our case numbers go up, as I mentioned, it more than likely will get into your workplace if you're having people report for work. And how do we handle quarantine and isolation? So depending on your industry, in general, quarantine is for those that have been exposed to a confirmed case of COVID, but may not be showing symptoms. That's a 14-day period, because the incubation period for the virus is that long. If you are confirmed positive, it's a 10-day period, and your symptoms need to be coming down. If you have a fever, it's 24 hours of no fever without taking fever-reducing medication. Your symptoms are improving, etc. Now, one question that we get that's interesting is, what if it's somebody in my house? And the same close contact requirements apply. So that quarantine period for somebody that has a confirmed case in their household could actually be longer if they're caring for that person, because they're going to be exposed potentially every single day until that person's recovered. But if they're separated in their house and not coming into close contact, if that works in that household, that quarantine period is 14 days from the last close contact. If you're in critical infrastructure, there are some differences on the quarantine period, not for those with symptoms, but those that have been exposed and do not have symptoms, that you can follow on the CDC guidelines.
Okay, and then just building on that real quickly. So for example, my husband has some coworkers who were, maybe in close contact with someone. So they're quarantined, but how far out does that go? Because then he was in contact with them, and then he's in contact with me. So it's really unclear. How far do you go?
It definitely gets hard. One of the reasons that employers have to notify local public health is not only to track outbreaks. And when we talk about these outbreak numbers in the workplace, I would like to reiterate, that's because the system is working. We know where those outbreaks are. Employers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then local public health will help with that contact tracing and provide some of those answers, because it can get a little bit weird. But if someone was exposed to a confirmed case, they are quarantined. If they're not confirmed themselves, they don't start to develop symptoms, those next couple of people down the line may or may not need to quarantine, but local public health will help you because they're really going to want to determine like how long were they exposed. And we do get this question often on so-and-so was at their friend's house over the weekend. They were confirmed. So-and-so is going to quarantine now. A negative test does not get you out of quarantine. And it's because that incubation period is 14 days. They can develop symptoms anytime within that 14-day period and go from a negative to a positive.
Okay, thank you. And then Sean, we do have some questions coming in through the Q&A function. The first one, I have a small business and own an office building as well. We also have tenants in our building that run businesses and want access to the building. How should we handle tenants that are not our employees?
So depending on how they structure their building, some buildings have like the landlord provides the main desk or something like that. Certainly perhaps a health screening or something there, but a couple of things you want to think about there is that as a landlord, you are not necessarily going to be responsible for the actions of that other business. You already know that, and you do not have an obligation to go check and make sure they're following the protocols within their workplace. But it certainly creates a challenge. Elevators, right? Depending on where you are, elevators create problems because you just can't maintain that social distance in there and those types of things. So it does create a lot of challenges. But I think that what you would want to do is if you own the building and run your business out of that building, make sure that you're controlling your employee population the best that you can, staggering entry and exit times the best that you can to avoid a lot of people piling up in lobbies or trying to get upstairs or do those types of things. And make sure you're posting those signs, not to come in if you're sick, you know, those types of things that you should be doing as a building owner.
Okay, thank you. Sean, is there any discussion about the My Symptoms reporting to be the same day versus a 1-day lag for a final report?
So if it hasn't launched yet, I thought it launched a few weeks ago. The My Symptoms app has upgraded itself to allow real time. So you can have somebody actually open up in real time and see who's taken it and who has not. The original setup was just as the person asked. It was a 1-day lag to whoever you identified, but I believe that's up and running now.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question about essential employees who cannot work remotely. It seems a little bit broad. What are the rules, for example, on car dealers, real estate agents, office personnel that process paperwork, essential paperwork for those kinds of transactions? What do you say about that?
So there, within the DHHS orders and the MIOSHA rules, there are no distinctions for critical infrastructure or essential. We don't really use the term essential now because that was part of the stay home, stay safe order in a differentiation between critical and those that weren't included. But when we're looking at critical infrastructure employees, that's going to be part of your remote work policy that in order to maintain my business, I do have these physical things that need to be done in the workplace and just part of your analysis.
Okay, thank you. Folks, I think we're going to have plenty of time for more Q&A, and I've got a couple stacked up here, but if you have any questions, please put those in the Q&A box at the bottom. It looks as though we will have time. We're going to take this one, and I'm just going to read it word for word. The attendee says, I'm a sneezer. In general, year-round. Should I be taking extra precautions? What type or style of mask should I be wearing if I am in the office or around other people in general?
So I think that's it raises two great points that we want to discuss. Is that when you do the questionnaire, these are typically intended to be new symptoms. If you look at just the questions in general from the CDC, sneezing and things like that are in there, but understand that some people have allergies, some people sneeze, some, you know, we all have our quirks, right? So that we have to manage the best that we can. So just pointing that out because some people get flagged on those questionnaires, even though these are sort of recurring themes for them. It's intended to be new. For the face covering, cloth face covering, CDC does not recommend those cloth face coverings that have the easy breathe valves, because those valves are allowing you, to essentially just exhaust everything that's inside that mask without really containing the virus. The goal is to pull those droplets and the aerosols as close to our face as possible with the face coverings. So I would encourage that person that has the sneeze, they're probably going to need a couple extra masks, but just be prepared on perhaps a secondary way to help cover around the outside of that mask to further pull that virus back in. Now, we've all seen the demonstrations on how far sneezes can travel. When you do sneeze with that mask on, you are going to exhale even more because they're not tight seal masks, right? You're going to have even more there, but just try to think about other things you can do to help when you have to sneeze, pull that back even closer.
Okay, thank you. Here's a kind of a general question, but very important. What can employees do to help their employer enforce COVID safety measures?
So employees have a role to play. When we talk about MIOSHA, it creates standards and obligations for the employer. And part of that is always employees raising issues with their employer to the extent that they can. We understand, and hopefully none of the workplaces that are watching today, but that you're going to talk with your employees to make sure that you're following the standards and do those types of things. If an employee can't do that, or it's futile to do that, they can call that 855-SAFE-C19 and talk about the issue they're having. If it's necessary, they will get them over to the complaint filing side of MIOSHA. Complaints can be filed anonymously, or they can just go online and file a complaint as well.
Okay, thank you.
But we really encourage employers to just work with employees, right? That the employee should feel confident in raising that issue. The management should be reasonable in responding to those kind of concerns. But definitely, if that's not going to work, file a complaint.
Okay, so that is actually a good lead into our next question. What if the employee refuses to get a test even though they are clearly exhibiting symptoms? What should the employer do, or what can they do?
So we're not allowed to give legal advice, but recently passed was some workplace protections for those that have COVID. It was similar to the executive order, which expanded the Paid Medical Leave Act, and that does include some language that deals with testing. So I would encourage the employer to check that out. It was House Bill 6032. It became Public Act. I don't recall the number off the top of my head, but I'm sure that you can find it, Diane.
Yes.
That kind of talks about some of those testing pieces. Certainly, if they're not going to test, you could talk to local public health and see if they want to do something there to work with that employee to try to get them to test. But you're going to want to follow that isolation period for sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let's see here. So this is a general question in regard to the rules that have been issued. What's being done to enforce the rules? What can we expect?
So from a MIOSHA workplace safety perspective, every employer knows that MIOSHA pretty much has authority over workplace safety and health, and does have the tools they need to enforce these if they need to. It is not the goal of MIOSHA to go and fine people, but there are fines available to them if they need to do that. Part of a citation would also be that you have to fix it. So that's the most important part in our opinion, is that if they find something, you have to fix it, or else they're going to stay with you. That case doesn't close until it's over. For the DHHS orders, that's going to be DHHS, local public health, local law enforcement.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here about the location of the preparedness and response plan. It sounds to me as though that's on the MIOSHA website, or the Michigan/coronavirus website. Is that correct?
It's actually on the Michigan.gov COVID workplace safety. Right there with all the guidelines and everything else, there's a little link, a link that says preparedness and response plan. That's the one.
That's the one. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, they're still rolling in, so we're going to clip right along here. So I'm not sure if you can speak to this, but I'm going to ask it. For businesses that have unfortunately incurred a fine for various COVID violations, can you give us an idea of how their plans were not feasible, or maybe their implementation fell a little bit short, so we know what to look out for?
Yeah, absolutely. So that, I think you're right on the money though, Diane, is that what MIOSHA is going to look for is your plan. There's no required format. The template that they've provided would give you a great format to use, but you can use your own as long as it incorporates those components of identifying the hazard, the types of employees you have and the hazards they're exposed to that's listed right in these guidelines. Having the plan in writing, making sure it's available to employees, doing the training and the daily health screenings. They're going to look at not only did you write one, but you're actually implementing it. And one of the questions I get quite often from the employer side is, what if my employees refuse to do so? And as employers, you need to enforce those rules, because MIOSHA is going to look at you to apply and implement those rules. And that includes making sure that your employees are participating as well. But those are the two pieces. Is they're going to look at, do you have a plan and are you implementing the plan? Because we have seen in some of the citations that have had to be issued that some places had great plans, just didn't actually follow through with implementing them, and some places didn't have plans at all, but were verbally doing some things in the workplace to make it happen.
Okay, thank you. So when employees are working remotely, but they sometimes interact with clients or customers or maybe even coworkers, should you still be doing daily health screenings?
So I can tell you in two ways. The way we do this at state too is that if you have folks that are working remotely that day they're not leaving the house, they do not need to do the daily health screening. If they are going to engage somewhere, then they need to do the daily health screening.
Okay.
And just note that in your plan, whatever your plan is that is how they're going to function.
Okay, that's good to know. Put it in the plan. All right, at this point in time, we only have one more question. So attendees, if you have questions, now is the time to type them in the Q&A box. We have time. So I'll read the last one that I have. How transparent do I need to be with my employees? Do I need to update them with who is in quarantine when it started, in order to allow their coworkers to reflect and decide if they were exposed and also need to consider a quarantine? Did that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense, and it creates some challenges. I know that employers have to be in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act as well, and some of the confidentiality that goes along with it. The way that we interpret notification of other coworkers is those that might have been exposed. So depending on your setup, if you have a larger establishment with kind of a group of workers on one end and a group of workers on the other, and you have a case on one side, you do not necessarily need to notify the others that there was a case. What we're looking for there and what you're looking for there are those that might have had close contacts. I believe that we can't, again, give legal advice, but I think the ADA has some, through the EEOC, has some write-ups on disclosure of names and other identifying information that you'd want to be familiar with to make sure that you're in compliance there. But the goal is just really the contact tracing piece.
Okay, great, thank you. I've got a question here about, because your department is issuing guidelines, the Health and Human Services Department is issuing guidelines. So how do you coordinate among the departments? I'm assuming there is a vast amount of coordination. What does that look like on the inside, Sean?
So we do a few things. We talk regularly, of course. We make sure that all of the agencies understand the scope of their authority and who is doing what. And that's why, as I mentioned at the outset, that the MIOSHA workplace safety rules will be more static, and DHHS will be looking at those things with COVID that will be more flexible. Certainly there is a little bit of overlap as they regulate some retail and bars and restaurants and what's happening in those spaces. If you read those, you'll see that that's more about the masking, trying to create that distance in ways that maybe workplace safety and health either couldn't or wouldn't do. We really want employers to get focused in on and understanding the rules and recognizing that there'll be some consistency there so that it makes it easier to understand and apply, and then layer in the DHHS piece. But we're communicating regularly. I also communicate a lot with local public health officials across the state of Michigan, and we do take referrals from them on things that they may find while they're out there doing what local public health does. Not necessarily outbreaks, but some of the sanitarians, as some businesses are familiar with, going to restaurants and other types of retail and stuff, and they'll share with us if they're seeing extreme non-compliance with the employee safety aspects.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I've got two more questions that came in. I think they're fairly short. One attendee asks, can I have my employees sign a form to be transparent if they choose? And I'm assuming that's transparent about their test results or symptoms or what have you.
Yeah, I wouldn't know the answer to that. My guess would be probably not, but I don't know that for sure. I think you'd want to check in with the EEOC on some of those pieces.
Okay, all right. This one is about masks. When an employee refuses to wear a mask for ADA purposes, does this need to be included in our plan? How does MIOSHA account for individuals who can't wear a mask due to ADA purposes?
Absolutely. MIOSHA from the beginning recognizes that employees that may be medically unable to tolerate a face covering can request a reasonable accommodation. So they would expect the employer and the employee to identify alternatives. The only caveat I would mention for everybody is to recognize that it cannot create an additional hazard for the employee, e.g. make it worse, and it cannot create a hazard for employees around them. So within the COVID world, that becomes a challenge in the sense that of like a face shield does not contain the virus to the extent that a face covering does. So that might be an alternative for that employee, but you'll want to think about how you separate them further. But definitely MIOSHA understands reasonable accommodations and you know, we'll look to the employer and the employees to have figured out a way to make that work. Just like all of you, we want as many people working as possible. We want to keep people working, even if they're medically unable to tolerate a mask in a safe way.
Okay. What happens if you have an employee who wears a mask, but not properly?
As the employer, you should definitely not only tell them how that's part of your training, right? This is how you wear a mask. This is how we expect you to wear a mask. And make sure that they're doing it. As I mentioned, you know, these standards and rules apply to employers, and you need to apply them to your employees as well.
Okay. And then Sean, one last question. Is it required for all employees to read and sign the preparedness plan or have it available for review?
It has to be available. It should be part of your training. Obviously, I have seen some industries, including a very large one up in your area, that has put together, you know, a wonderful plan, very, very long, probably not something you're going to train on every component of. You should have that available, at least electronically. It can be an intranet. I know a lot of companies have, you know, an employee sign-in portal, have it available there for them to review, and then definitely make sure you're incorporating in your training, which I know you all would do, those pieces that are pertinent to that part of your operation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I think we've covered it very, very well with all of the questions. And with that, I'm going to bounce it back to Tony. Thank you, Sean.
Great, thanks, Diana. Yeah, I want to join and thank you, Sean. I think very informative. We really appreciate you taking time to be with us today. So thank you so much. We appreciate your expertise and insights. Midland Business Alliance just wants to again thank Sean and thank all of you for your time today. We're also, as I mentioned, very grateful for our sponsors who make our 2020 programming possible. We're glad to have so many attendees this morning. Did want to make sure tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock we have issues and answers. Rich Studley, the president of the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, will be joining us discussing what do election results mean for Michigan. So not too late to sign up if you'd like to join us for that. Rich has always got fascinating perspectives and a wealth of knowledge. So please stay tuned to the Midland Business Alliance for the latest news on COVID-19 as it impacts the business community. There were some questions on specifics. We will post this. We recorded this to our website, so feel free to go there and look at it. And with that, hope you have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.